So the next slide is the measles background. And why is it an indicator disease? First, as I'll show you in another slide, it is highly contagious. It's the most infectious of the vaccine-preventable diseases. When you have a problem in immunity levels in the population, the first disease you'll often see is measles. Number two is there is a distinct clinical syndrome. Now, there is a differential diagnosis. Rash illness with fever is not necessarily measles, but in contrast, for example, to polio, where the vast majority of infections are not clinically apparent paralysis, everyone who gets measles has a rash illness with fever. That is, virtually all cases are clinically apparent. Fourth is we have reasonable diagnostic tests. Primarily the IgM test is very sensitive and specific for confirming the disease. Another thing that is very important about measles is it's not constant. You get an epidemic, cases go up, and population susceptibility goes down as a result of both wild virus infection and any efforts that are made to vaccinate to reduce susceptibility, and then disease incidence goes down. And in fact, one of the problems has been is thinking when the disease incidence goes down, it's going to be permanently down. But each day, susceptibles are born and add to the susceptibles, and later will fuel an epidemic. But what's very important with measles is an acceptable level changes. So the level acceptable before vaccination goes down with each outbreak. And so today in the US, we had over 500,000 cases reported in the pre-vaccine era. We're all upset that we had almost 400 cases reported last year. The country went berserk because the number of cases is unacceptable. And there are a number of complications, including hospitalizations and deaths, that motivate change. And to just show you this, this is a mathematical modelers can estimate something called R0, or the basic reproduction number. And what that means is in a 100% susceptible population, this is the average number of cases that would result in the second generation if you introduce somebody with a given disease into that population. And you can see here, if you look at the basic reproduction numbers for the vast majority of vaccine-preventable diseases, measles is at the top of the list. And it leads to calculation of a community immunity threshold, or herd immunity threshold. And that is R0 minus 1 over R0. And to illustrate that, let me use a simple example. If you have an R0 of 4, then that says that the average case of a given disease is capable of transmitting to 4 persons if all of those persons that they came in contact with were susceptible. If you have a 75% immunity level in that population, in other words, 3 of the 4 are immune, then the average case will only give rise to 1 case, and you will have constant level. If the immunity level goes above 75%, the average case will give rise to less than 1 case, and immunity will die out. And what you could see here in this slide is because of the high R0 levels for measles, measles requires the highest herd immunity threshold. This is just a picture of a child with measles, with a rash illness, and the classic cases, spots or red rash that is associated with it. And this is a famous slide from Saul Krugman looking at measles. And what happens with measles is you start with a prodrome, and the prodrome involves generally one or more of these 3 C's: conjunctivitis or photophobia, coryza or runny nose, and cough. And they all start before the rash. The incubation period averages about 12 days. It generally is 10 to 14 days. And it starts with the onset of these symptoms and gradual increase in fever. The issue in the, these are in Fahrenheit degrees, but it's not unusual in centigrade to get up to over 40 degrees centigrade, and the kids are very toxic. And complex spots are white spots inside the buccal mucosa that occur a day or two before rash, and then the first few days of rash that are pathognomonic for measles. And this is the classic case. It is what's called a centrifugal rash. It's focused particularly on the face, and then it goes down to the body, and over time it moves out, but the greatest concentrations are on the central part of the virus, and then it fades. And complications, unfortunately, are not unusual. In industrialized countries such as the US, otitis media or ear infections are most common. Pneumonia is the most severe and is the leading cause of death. Diarrhea is also very common. Another thing which leads to brain damage is post-infection encephalitis. And one thing that occurs on an average about 7 years afterwards is something called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which is a chronic encephalitis universally leading to death. And we see about 1 to 3 deaths per 1,000. In the developing world, death can be much more common. And the death to case ratio generally ranges from 2 to 15%. As in the industrialized world, the most common cause of death is pneumonia, which could be a primary measles pneumonia, or more commonly, a secondary bacterial superinfection. And diarrhea is the second most common cause of death. Measles in areas where vitamin A deficiency is common is a common cause of blindness. And as of the most recent year, it still is estimated more than 100,000 persons, primarily children, die from measles. And neurological complications, as seen in industrialized countries, are also not that uncommon, but certainly less common than diseases like pneumonia and diarrhea.